Good evening and welcome to the combined meeting of the East Lansing Planning Commission and Housing Commission. The joint meeting. This is 6 o'clock, just after 6 o'clock on Wednesday, September 22nd. I'll ask Mr. Fehrenbach to please call roll.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with the Planning Commission. Lapine.
Present.
Wolf. Here. Williams.
Here.
Sullivan.
Here.
Bowman.
Here.
Cahill. Jack.
Here.
Hendricks. Wagner.
Here.
Boyle.
Here.
Okay, and then the Housing Commission. Irene Cahill.
Here.
Wood.
Here.
Rosen.
Here.
Ferguson.
Here.
Cannon.
Here.
Freeman.
Here.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Fehrenbach. Just to note for logistics, I thought there were two microphones. There's one at this end of the table, and there's one currently available for public comments, which we'll be taking in a moment, at which time I think that's going to be moved to the north side of the table, the north table. We all received a copy of the agenda in our packet. I would entertain a motion to approve that agenda. That's been moved by Commissioner Jack Cahill. Is there a second? Second. Seconded by Commissioner Wolf. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call for just a voice vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? That motion carries. At this time on our agenda, we'll take communications from citizens. I do see we have a couple of people joined us here this evening, and so I'll invite you to come forward to the mic. Typically, we would ask that you state your name, and you're not obligated to do so, but it will help us in keeping minutes. Welcome, Ms. Hill.
Hi. Is this on? I'm Ann Hill from 685 Buteo. I'd like to thank the Joint Housing and Planning Commission for the opportunity to speak. I understand that staff is seeking input and discussion on future policies and action items for housing. In reading the report submitted, there is reference made to stakeholders being contacted for input. I'd like to know who those stakeholders were. For example, in the planning process section, it states that, quote, other key stakeholders with a direct interest in housing, and the following paragraph refers to, quote, numerous builders and property managers. My hope is that the creators of the report did not discount other members of the East Lansing community. I would like to see this information shared with the Council of Neighborhood Presidents. Ms. Irwin did come to the Council of Neighborhood Presidents after the market analysis was completed, but it was simply to provide a presentation on the portion of the study that had been done earlier without much discussion. I didn't see it listed in the document, but perhaps that's something that you're planning on doing. Many members of the CONP have represented their neighborhoods for several years or know long-term neighborhood members who have a significant amount of history that they would be willing to share. Unfortunately, at this moment in time, we have a great loss of institutional knowledge in both city council and city staff. So it may be helpful to reach out to the residents to offset that gap. I will share that when the city council and city manager wanted voters to approve the city income tax, they almost begged the neighborhood presidents or neighborhood representatives to have neighborhood meetings and invite the city manager and then Mayor Meadows to bring their presentation to our neighborhoods so they could tell us why we should vote for the tax. It would be welcome to have similar energies put forward for this activity. How our financial resources are spent is of great importance to many of us. For example, I can tell you that in 2007, the city required the Beaumont Apartments located off Coleman Road to build mixed-use housing, which they did. After many years of trying to get businesses to lease those commercial spaces, no businesses were willing to rent the ground level suites. Management came back to the city to request that they be allowed to turn those units into residential apartments at an additional cost to the Beaumont. I believe it was about $400,000 additional that they had to invest. If the property on West Road were to be rezoned, as this report suggests, as an option, it should not be assumed that mixed-use development is something that will necessarily be successful there. If mixed-use housing is desirable in, let's say, Portland, Oregon, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be successful in East Lansing. In my opinion, this project focuses on what is best for developers, stating, quote, the key question is, how can the city of East Lansing attract more builders and developers? followed by the statement, they will tend to focus on large markets with high values and potential for greater profit margins, such as the city of East Lansing. Incentives such as acquiring land, extending infrastructure to the site, and creative financing options were offered to lure these developers. The reason builders and developers are looking for these lucrative incentives is that it helps offset any risk to them and allows them a higher profit margin while transferring that risk from their shoulders to squarely on the shoulders of the community and the taxpayers that are left to bear the costs. Quite frankly, over the past 15 to 20 years, the city has pursued various incentives to lure developers, and things more often than not have kind of gone sideways. The result being that the residents of East Lansing have had to pay millions of dollars to offset risks that should have been the responsibility of the developers. This is a part of doing business. If they are not willing to, then perhaps the project should not go forward. If the developer is not willing to take on the risk, the members of the community should not be willing to either. May I offer to the Commission examples of projects that have cost the residents and taxpayers millions of dollars. The Evergreen project, where we've paid not only interest, but accounting and legal fees associated with restructuring the bonds. The Avondale Square project, which was not well received as originally planned and hoped for, and was only recently the bonds were paid off. And then, of course, we have the various versions of the Center City project. Again, excessive residual costs had to be borne by the taxpayers. As the study mentions, there are several significant factors going on simultaneously right now, and we won't know the consequences or outcomes for several months or even a year or two. These factors could make a big difference in the success of any option that might be chosen. Examples: the MSU students are being required to live on campus for the first 2 years. Post-COVID impacts on how we work and live, more working from home. The current economic slowdown and inflation, fuel, lumber and building materials, labor shortages, supplier part shortages for all kinds of products, including water heaters, appliances, fixtures, and even the most recent that I've heard a lot about is the inability to buy furniture. A potential housing bust or stock market downturn similar to 2008. The prices of housing stock in 2021 has been ridiculously expensive and is not sustainable. This is not just in East Lansing, but all over. Therefore, I would like to recommend to the Planning and Housing Commissions that rather than rush to take a proposal to City Council for approval and quick implementation, think it through, pursue true dialogue with the members of the community, not just developers and builders or those with, quote, direct interest in housing, end quote, but truly reach out to the community. You may find that the community is not willing to continue the massive building projects that have been going on in the downtown area for the past decade plus. Thank you for your time and consideration. I would like to add one more thing, possibly decreasing the regulations so that homeowners and even the rental housing, so that they can afford to make those upgrades and increase the values of their properties. I'd like to ask you to consider those. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Any other members of the public who'd like to take this opportunity to address the Housing and/or Planning Commissions? Seeing no one come forward. So that will move us on to our third item, the new business for this evening. It's the Housing Study and Strategic Plan, Next Steps.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll start with an introduction of staff. I've met most of you in person, but some only via Zoom, and some are meeting for the first time tonight.
Could I just indicate that Commissioner Hendricks has joined us about 10 after 6. Welcome.
Thank you. So my name is Tom Fehrenbach. I'm the Director of Planning, Building, and Development for the City of East Lansing. I really appreciate all of you taking the time on this kind of gloomy evening to come and talk to us about really an important planning effort for the future of housing in East Lansing. With me tonight I have Peter Menzer, who is the Planning and Zoning Administrator and has joined the city. I think he's been here for about 4 months and certainly has hit the ground running. We're very blessed to have Peter with us. As we are also to have Annette Irwin, who is our Housing and University Relations Administrator. Taking notes for us tonight and very helpful in our department over there is Rebecca Urdialis with the best seat in the house. And she is the Secretary for the Planning and Zoning Division. And also new to our team is Raphael Kaysen, who's our community development analyst and has been very helpful on this project as well. So with that, obviously we've had a lot of support on this effort from Land Use USA, Urban Strategies, and that's really Sharon Woods down there. And then I think the kind of lion's share of the presentation today from staff and our partners will be taking place by Justin Sprague of CIB Planning, who really was instrumental in putting together the strategic plan. What I'd like to suggest as sort of a run of show tonight is to kind of spend the first 15 minutes to have Justin kind of run through the main points of the strategic plan, open it up for a Q&A with both Justin and Sharon, our experts here, to help answer your questions that you might have, and then transition into really the short-term action plan that staff has distilled from sort of the larger study into some short-term actions we think are accomplishable in the nearer term. And certainly want to hear your feedback, perspective, if we're on the right track there. This is obviously an iterative process, and we very much would look forward to your input tonight. So with that, I'd probably pass it over to Justin, if that's okay.
Good evening to both commissions, and thank you for having us here tonight. It's an honor and a privilege to present this to you this evening and to talk to you a little bit about our process, our project, our methodology, how we got to where we were going, and sort of everything in between. And this was really sort of a two-part project. And you've already had a presentation from Sharon and understanding what her target market analysis is. Typically, Sharon and I work together quite frequently, where she has provided the key sort of data inputs, what's happening relative to our residents, our community, around housing, price points for housing, new housing builds, and then migration, who's coming in and who's leaving. And for for that perspective, she provides a lot of information to us sort of on what the picture is. And then secondly, the thing that we really like to look at is what is the histrionics of housing in the community and the policies that have been put in place around housing, and sort of why those policies were put in place, what were they trying to achieve with those policies, and were they achieving those goals? And then further, what are some ways to sort of achieve some of the I guess the fruits of the data that Sharon has indicated to try to attract new markets into the community, to try to diversify some markets, and really wondering and understanding how the regulatory environment can affect that, both from people being able to purchase and lease new housing in the city, as well as developers coming to upgrade or build new housing in the community. And so right out of the gate, I wanted to just kind of walk through on the table of comments page, or table of contents, which is page 1. There are a number of sections that you were probably able to see, sort of a brief introduction and planning process, and a geographic overview of the community, and sort of what are we looking at from a perspective of geography. And then we jump right into section C, which is the strategic plan. And in this case, that section is really an introduction to ideas and a high-level overview of what we've learned through the process. And from a stakeholder perspective, for us to really understand how the policies are working, we need to be able to interact with those that are being directly impacted by those policies. And so we did do a number of stakeholder interviews with property management companies like DTN throughout the community, and some developers that have built. We spoke with the housing group that is part of the Newman Lofts downtown, and have had a chance to speak with them as to what was happening there. We did speak to some of the builders in the area, and we spoke with staff quite frequently. And so from there, that was more of an opportunity for us to get a sense of what's happening around development itself. What are people seeing in the housing market? What are costs? We wanted to understand student housing and where student housing is happening, or how it's happening, or why it's happening. And so just out of the gate, we were able to learn pre-COVID, before the cost of building materials were going up and increasing, that to build what we would consider to be, middle-income housing that a middle-income family that was earning somewhere between, let's say, $40,000 and $80,000 a year for a family of 4 could afford, that somewhere in the range of $180,000 to $250,000 is that price point. And here we were finding, even from our builders that we spoke with, that it's nearly impossible to build at that price point today for a number of reasons. Part of it is cost of materials, part of it is cost of labor, part of it is regulation in the land itself, the cost of permitting. And so we immediately wanted to understand if diversification and providing a wider, more attainable level of housing throughout the community, how do we start to manipulate inputs in that process to get a more affordable option throughout the community. And part of that was, I can talk to those 3 points on page 7. One of those points was to find opportunities for the city to acquire land itself, whether through a tax foreclosure process or otherwise, where the city has the ability to sort of control the costs of that property, knowing that if it's a vacant piece of property, anything that's built there going forward is going to provide new revenue and new tax input to the city. And so that was one of our recommendations, is wherever we can find vacant land that's currently not city-owned, if there is an opportunity for that to come back to the city through a land bank or a foreclosure process, get a hold of that land. And currently that does happen. So through the Land Banking Authority, the City of East Lansing does have the first right of refusal on property. That may go through the foreclosure process. And again, this isn't a situation where we're saying to provide a fire sale on land to a developer. Land is a cost of doing business. Permitting is a cost of doing business. But there is a better opportunity for the city to be able to negotiate for a better development with that developer with some flexibility on the land price, knowing that in the future you're going to get new tax revenue on that property as a result of the development if there's nothing already developed. Number 2, we talk about utilizing planned unit development a little more often. Currently, there are 3 types of alternative development methods, whether PUD or traditional neighborhood development or cluster development within the city's zoning code. And those 3 tools offer the city greater flexibility to implement a higher quality project, whether it be a higher percentage of mixed income housing or a better design. But right now, the limits of those opportunities are really restrained by the Chapter 50 of the zoning code and the area of land that might, and the area of land that might be needed as a result of those.
I just want to clarify, because there's 3 different sets of page numbers. If you're following along, this is the one that's page ultimately 7, 9, or 10. But if you go back to the sort of the base document, it's just been referred to as page 7, but it's been paginated several times. And so if you want to follow along specifically, because that's going to help, just be aware that.
Yeah, and
you don't have all
no.
3 sets. So,
and that's fine.
So, but moving forward, just be aware that Justin's going to be referring to the original page numbers.
Sure, and to clarify that, the page number I'm referring to is the highest page number at the bottom of the page. So it'd be a bold number, a line, and followed by the word page. So I'm currently on page 7 according to that. So you're welcome. And then the last thing was the idea of potentially extending infrastructure to sites if there is not infrastructure in place. And this is only for a situation where the community understands that the result of that development and the cost of investing in that development are going to far outweigh the benefit to the community, or the benefit will be far outweighing the cost to the community. Meaning, if there are potential budget implications that could negatively impact the city or the community surrounding, that option should not be done. But if you have a situation where you have some vacant land and you have the opportunity to utilize some creative tools to ensure that development will occur and it will generate the outcomes the community is looking for, that has been a good option. And a case in point I can point to, the city of Corona in Shiawassee County had a piece of property that they wanted to extend water main through to create a city loop. At the time, the city manager recognized that it was a vacant piece of city-owned property and that they needed housing. And so what did they need to do to put a water system in, a sewer system, and a road, and then eventually develop 14 lots for middle-income housing. When they went through this entire process, it was done at a cost of about $60,000 per lot for those 14 lots. They sold those lots to the developer for $20,000 a lot, again, which is a significant reduction in price. However, that was vacant land, and the estimated tax revenue of each house on that and each on those 14 lots was about $5,000 a year. And so you take that, times that out across the 14 lots year over year, and that's all new revenue coming into the community, creating middle-income housing, not high-end housing, but they were specific to middle-income housing, meaning they wanted those houses to be priced between $150,000 and $180,000, no more. And they were able to achieve that. So in a situation, it may seem risky to go through this process, but again, if the benefits are there to the community, you always have to look at that. Moving forward, section D, starting on page 9, is titled Financing. And this section really kind of touches on all of the tools that are available either through the state, through the local community, or federally to assist in developing. And specifically developing in the middle to moderate income levels, or low to moderate income levels. Such as opportunity zones, the brownfield redevelopment program, the neighborhood or the MSHDA multifamily direct lending, as well as the first home buyer down payment assistance. Another thing that we talk about is the idea of a neighborhood improvement authority. One of the key points of this project was recognizing our existing neighborhoods, our 25 existing neighborhoods throughout the city, and their importance and significance to the city and its development over time, and how aging neighborhoods tend to sometimes deteriorate or do not seem to get the property improvements done to them because they are costly. And so a neighborhood improvement authority is another type of tool that's out there that can be utilized similar to a downtown development authority or a brownfield redevelopment authority. You can establish this neighborhood zone and utilize property improvements in that zone to create a tax increment finance structure that can then be reinvested into that neighborhood for fixing water, sewer, roads, curb and gutter, or providing grants or small loans to homeowners that are seeking additional funding to help improve their properties. And so again, I didn't really specifically take any of the incentives that were in here and hold one up over the other to say this is an absolute, you should do this, but I wanted you to at least be aware of the tools that were out there that could potentially work on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis and a project by project basis. So that way you're fully armed as a commission with the tools and can speak to those instances where those tools might be useful or where they may not. Moving into the next section, E is my page 15, regulatory environment. This is really just tipping the idea, or talking about the idea that right now in the building and construction community, anywhere between 18 and 30% of the cost of the home itself or the unit itself is for regulation. And so that means it means cost for sewer connections, water connections, building permit fees, purchasing of the land, any kind of fees related to putting in road or things of that nature. So right out of the gate, 18 to 30% of the cost of the end price of that home are determined by the regulatory environment. And in this case, we didn't make too many specific recommendations to the regulatory environment other than one that spoke to the idea that time tends to cost more to developers or to the city when it comes to executing deals. And so we did make the recommendation that the city take a look at its development review process specific to site plan, special land use, and other zoning and administrative reviews, and consider returning the ultimate approval of that process to the Planning Commission, as opposed to having it be reviewed by the Planning Commission and ultimately approved by City Council. That's what the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act calls for, but it does give communities, it still does give communities the ability to retain that ultimate approval right with City Council. And in this case, it would still recognize that planned unit developments and rezoning would be retained by City Council or have final authority to approve per the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. But in this instance, it was really about speeding up the process, having a less confusing process, sort of having a one-stop shop. A developer could bring a site plan to the Planning Commission and walk away with approval that evening, potentially. And so that was our primary recommendation there, and that's mostly as a result of my team being a technical advisor to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation's Redevelopment Ready Communities program, and that is what they are teaching right now as part of their development review process module and best practice. So this is just a direct reflection of that process. And that's all we spoke to really around the regulatory environment. Next, we move into section F, which is page 17, speaking directly to land use, zoning, and other policies. And this is really where we start to look at the numerous policies over the years that have provided a direct impact on the housing market in the city of East Lansing. Specific to the rental overlay districts, looking at the Civil Rights Act, naming students as a protected class of purchaser or leaser of a home, as well as potentially looking at, well, we looked at the consolidated plan, which is the tool that the city submits to Housing and Urban Development to continue to receive CDBG eligibility, and that was just recently updated and resubmitted. We looked at the age-limited housing and whether or not Ordinance 1384 should be expanded, or in this case, we said that you could even possibly reduce the number of age-limited housing from a 25% mandate to somewhere 15%, but we didn't put a number on it because we thought that was a good discussion for this commission to have. Ultimately, what we were seeing is that the market analysis that Sharon did not provide overwhelming evidence for a specific number, whether it be 25%, 20%, 30%. It just stated that there are a number of residents that are both looking to stay in the community or move into the community, that those residents, that those demographics crossed all age groups, and that there was a high demand for all age groups throughout the community. And so it did not specifically say that there was an overwhelming demand in the 55 over group and under demand and everything else. We did find, she found it across all age groups. So that was our only thought there, is that you may, for those downtown projects, you may, because Newman Lofts at the time was struggling to fully fulfill its open spaces, you may want to look at that at some point in the future. But that was not a major recommendation. We did also look, because as I mentioned, the ordinance overlays and ordinance 900, the rental overlays, at this time, we were not recommending that the city make any changes in those. While they are cumbersome programs, or could be cumbersome, both administratively and for potential tenants and landlords, because it's been tested in court, because it is working to an extent now for the city, it might be costlier and more difficult to undo it and then find out that you may not be able to redo it to some extent. So at this point, we feel that continued discussion around that is warranted, and that you can continue to determine whether or not these two things are working for you, meaning the civil rights ordinance and as well as the overlay restrictions, rental overlay districts, as well as the stipulation of two unrelated persons in a rental situation. As it stands now, like I said, our recommendation is, because it has been tested, keep it as it is, but continue to discuss. We also talk about the planned unit development. This is on page 21, traditional neighborhood and cluster ordinances. And these are three tools that we felt were underutilized throughout the community. And again, why we feel they're underutilized is because of the restrictions that are placed on them. Specifically, if you were to go into, I guess it would be the third paragraph in the middle, I start with the word currently. It says these tools are only offered within certain zoning districts and in some instances are limited to properties of a certain size, such as 20 acres or more. So when you are already putting that 20 acre or more stipulation on there, you're already eliminating all of your existing neighborhoods for any infill development, unless you can compile at least 20 acres. And if one of the goals here is to stabilize our existing neighborhoods and provide additional opportunity for reinvestment or new investment in those neighborhoods, these are tools that you don't want a size minimum on, because they give the Planning Commission and the city the flexibility to get a stronger project with more desirable outcomes in exchange for some flexibility for the developer. And that flexibility doesn't always have to be financial. It can be density flexibility. It can be design flexibility. It can be height flexibility. It can be any types of, a number of things. It could be additional landscaping flexibility. But the ability here for the city to have the authority to negotiate with the developer for the desired outcomes, meaning we want more mixed income, meaning we want to be able to have a mix or diversity of housing types, this is your best tool to do this. And so that was one thing that I thought was one of my strong recommendations, is try to identify how to better utilize these tools. Secondly, what you can do with these tools is when you identify areas that you think might fit for a planned unit development or a traditional neighborhood or a cluster ordinance, you can sort of pre-plan what that development looks like. So this commission or these commissions can work with staff to say, this area, specifically here we can use the West Road example because I called it out as city-owned property. You can sort of master plan that space for what you think it should be or how you think it should be, and adopt that as your PUD plan for that area. And then from that point forward, developers that come forward that may be interested in that space have to show you how they are meeting your PUD plan that you've already approved for that space. And so it gives them, right out of the gate, some idea of what it is you're looking for and what they need to do to accomplish that. And so it provides a little bit of certainty to them, but again, not at the cost of the community. It gives you the bargaining power and the leverage to ensure that you're getting the development that you want. Lastly, within this section, starting on page 22, we talk about a series of bills that are currently under legislative review. There was a package of 7 bills recently introduced to both the State House and the State Senate, identifying the need for new housing, specifically workforce housing throughout the state of Michigan and within our communities. And each one of these bills represented an opportunity to support new projects throughout the community, such as expanding neighborhood enterprise zones, allowing pilot programs, or what we call payment in lieu of taxes as an incentive to a developer across the board, not just on specific projects. Others include a tax abatement that is commonly shared in the industrial community, where a retrofit of an existing industrial building can qualify for up to 12 years to have 50% of their taxes on a new investment be abated for that investment, or up to 100% on new construction. That's extending now, if this bill passes, that extends to the homeowner level, and would allow the homeowners as well the opportunity to receive this tax credit, potentially to have 50% of the investment on their new investment in improving their home be abated for a period of time. We don't know if this is going to pass yet or not, but it's a tool that could greatly improve the opportunities for residents and their ability to improve their homes or expand upon their homes in existing neighborhoods. So again, with all of these tools, before any of them are implemented, they need to be passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And anytime we're looking at the opportunity to abate any kind of taxes for any reason, we need to understand the fiscal impact of that when we're looking at our overall community budget. And any opportunity where that fiscal impact could outweigh the opportunity or the benefit to the community, that's not something that we make practice of doing often. So lastly, I have on page 25, there are sort of 9 recommended items, action items, that we vetted with staff and sort of put in order here for the commission to consider. I'll just run through each one of these really quickly. One is to review the existing PUD traditional neighborhood and cluster ordinance to determine if they could better be implemented across the city. 2, look to adopt the land use recommendations of the 2018 City Master Plan, including amending the zoning code to create a new form-based zoning hybrid, which is one of the recommendations for districts in downtown area and immediately surrounding the downtown area. 3, revise the development review process to grant final site plan approval as well as other administrative approvals back to the Planning Commission. 4, identify specific neighborhoods, particularly older neighborhoods, that could benefit from the establishment of a neighborhood improvement authority or PUD planning. 5, continue to enforce the existing rental overlay program, but recognize that there is high demand for for-lease missing middle options, so do not shy away from new potential for-lease development opportunities. 6, maintain ordinance 900 and 900A as well as existing non-conforming structure ordinances. 7, review existing PUD traditional neighborhood and cluster ordinances to determine, sorry, that was already at the top. 8, consider reducing the age-limited requirements from Ordinance 1384 from 25% to 20 or 15. But that's something that this commission can discuss to determine how that ordinance is really impacting the community. And 9, review existing funding programs for down payment assistance and rehab assistance for best practices and improvements. And that's something that staff would like to work on this commission with. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor to any questions that anyone would have.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Sprague?
You did mention Airbnbs. What are your thoughts on Airbnbs in this community?
So I understand that Airbnbs are sort of a hot topic right now, and to sort of, I guess, qualify my bias towards Airbnbs, I do currently reside on the Michigan Association of Planning's Planning Law Committee, which is responsible for looking at new legislation as it comes to the state of Michigan, how it impacts housing or other planning and zoning related topics. And one of the bills that we're currently looking at right now is a potential short-term rental bill and the impacts that they have on communities. And it's sort of a push-pull at this point. I do believe that there should be a level of regulation around Airbnb. In my mind, they should be a classic special land use situation where the community has the ability to not only license but issue special land uses for those properties. Because of the nature of them and the fact that you're in a college community and those Airbnbs can potentially be nuisances, either from noise, parties, or other situations, I firmly support the idea that they should have a special license that can be pulled from them if they are becoming a nuisance for the community. I did not speak to them specifically in this study because of the legislation and what it could mean for short-term rentals at this time. It's sort of up in the air, and there was last I had heard, we do have a planning law committee meeting scheduled for next week, but last I had heard is that there was a bill that was introduced that sort of took zoning out of the equation altogether and would not allow a community to either zone for them or recognize them as commercial businesses. And there was a lot of pushback from the Michigan Municipal League, Michigan Township Association, and the Michigan Association of Planners. So until that's resolved, we're kind of up in the air on how we can regulate them.
Because they do work in other college communities.
Correct.
Other questions for Mr. Sprague?
Just really quick, one of the things I probably should have asked your colleague when she was kind enough to present to us on the Planning Commission previously, but when you were doing this study, did you take a look at any currently available vacancy data? So anything that spoke to, obviously it's difficult right now with COVID, but anything that spoke to the vacancy rates of any of our rental units at the time that the study was done?
Yes, so we looked at vacancy rates in two ways. We looked at the American Communities Survey, which is, there's always a lag with that data. And then we also did a detailed real estate analysis to kind of do an estimate of how many units are actually available that are existing choices on the market, available either for lease and for purchase. So we did look at it in two different ways. I didn't see anything really alarming in the vacancy rates, honestly. I felt that the vacancy rates were moderate to low, and surprisingly, I haven't seen a real spike in the vacancies with COVID either. But it's something definitely that it's come up before in our conversations with the city staff, and it is something that has come up as a question to say maybe in a year or 2 years we should go back and restudy vacancy rates again when we have the data that shows what did COVID, what did the pandemic and the economic crisis really do to some of those variables. So those are things that we can revisit as well.
Thank you.
I got just a quick.
It's more of a, I think, a comment that I'm trying to deal with. This is great information, I think. But I'm trying to deal with the idea that the master plan has about a walkable downtown, a denser downtown. And some of the ideas you have here, I think, are in conflict with that. Like developing West Road, to me, doesn't seem to meet anything about downtown. And lots of people want to live downtown because it's close to MSU and bars and stuff. And also your number 8 action of reducing the age limit from 25 to 20% or 15, which to me would just increase the student population, which is not what we really want in the master plan. I was just wondering what you thought about those sort of tensions.
Sure, no, I understand, and that makes a lot of sense. The specific draw to West Road was a question that staff and our team discussed quite frequently. And as the master plan was prepared, are there areas, specifically larger chunks of land that are currently available that are planned for one thing that may make sense for another thing? So at the time, that area is planned for more of commercial, but it doesn't recognize the high demand currently for housing in the community, especially given its location to 127 and those folks that may want to live in the community but commute out of the community for work or other purposes. So it was really more of a recommendation of that site, sort of taking another look at areas that have that are vacant land currently and have the ability to possibly handle some of the demand for the housing currently in the city, and recognizing that not every city resident may want to be in a downtown environment, that there are commuter residents as well that would like to live in the city for the quality of living that the city provides. So it was really more of an opportunity to just really kind of go back and look at that again and understand if the sort of the conditions that were present at the time that was planned as it was, are those still present, or are we in a space where taking another look at it is a good thing for the community? So that was primarily, and then the second question was about the age limited and how, if that's reduced. I can understand how that may sort of create a tidal wave or an opportunity for more student rental. Essentially, in this case, what we were really trying to understand was why, with the vacancy rates that were happening in Newman Lofts after we talked to their housing representatives, and it was the residents representatives, not the development representatives. We spoke to the resident representatives for Newman Lofts, And they were stating that their concern with the high number there was a result of the vacancy, or the number requirement, the 50 or 25% was the result of the vacancy. And in our mind, there wasn't enough data to sway the conversation either way. It could be a vacant rate due to the high cost of living there, just as much as it could be the demand for those spaces. And so that's why we didn't do a hard recommendation that you should consider changing that or dropping that number. It was more of, we didn't see overwhelming demand that justified raising that number, and there wasn't significant demand, demand to lower it. So there's just a couple of factors to look at.
Yeah, could we just clarify, the 25% requirement applies only to the downtown development area?
Correct.
And it's 25% must be either owner occupied, age restricted, or income qualified.
Correct.
Or a combination thereof. So it isn't really as though we're saying 25% of new residential property has to be age qualified.
Correct.
Commissioner Hammond, please. Yes. There's a mic right next to you. Thank you.
I have a.
As a member of the Housing Commission, we're charged with advocating for low and middle income housing, seniors, and people with disabilities. And in pursuit of that, I toured 3 different units at the Newman Lofts. If that were a design that was meant for senior living, it isn't apparent to me. And I have questions about whether it even meets fair housing standards. And I think if it had been a better design, there wouldn't be any vacancies there, regardless of the price. My husband and I were prepared to move in there, but it just doesn't have any of the design elements that aging in place needs. And I would like to see universal design become a higher priority in whatever steps we take. Because it's so much easier to do it. It's so much easier to build universal design in rather than go back and retrofit. After the fact.
Yeah, this one.
Let's make that one circulation.
Okay. Would you like this one?
And I noticed that in reading past housing surveys, particularly the one that I think was produced in 2014, the need for low and moderate income for seniors and others was noted as an urgent need then, and it still is now. And as far as the PUDs and the overlay districts, I'm wondering, is that kind of exclusionary zoning preventing families from being able to rent or move in there? When statistics show us that upwards of 40 to 45% of children are now being born to single parents. So those overlay restrictions they're not just keeping students out, they're keeping out families. And that's a concern I'd like to see us address. And I'd like to know your thoughts on all of those 3 points. Thank you.
Just a minute, Commissioner Kate, I'm going to have Mr. Sprague respond to that.
Yeah, I can speak for a moment.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question and the comment about universal design. I think that is a good comment, and to the extent that you can find opportunities to require universal design is important. Just because access and attainability are two of the most important factors when considering housing choice and where to live and how to live. And so if you do have the ability to consider universal design or to require some form of universal design or ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act standards, I don't think there's anything that's going to negatively impact your outcomes with that. Second, I'm a firm believer that traditional zoning has been one of the greatest segregatory tools of our time. And it's not only been segregatory by race and demographic, but it's also been segregatory by income levels and class of citizen. And so for me, any time that you can bring a tool to the table that increases the ability to allow all types of citizen to have access to a neighborhood or to a community is going to be a good thing. And so in this case, I see, I don't know if the city would be prepared to go to the level of zoning that I would consider to be good zoning, which would be to take your lowest density or your highest density unit essentially and move that across the entire city. Because in those highest density zoning districts, that's where you typically have the lowest minimum requirements for first floor square footage for a new construction. That's where you have the lowest lot area requirements. But again, I know this is just in my ideal world. This doesn't work for all communities. And so by utilizing the PUD zoning classification or the traditional neighborhood or the cluster options, you do have some more flexibility to build into the quality of development that you're trying to achieve and utilizing some of those trade-offs, those density trade-offs or housing unit type trade-offs in exchange for some of the quality development that you're looking for. But I'll go ahead and let Sharon just speak to a little bit of, I don't believe that I saw the 2014 survey that spoke to the overwhelming demand for the low to moderate senior housing, but I know Sharon really dove deep into data around the demographics, so I'll let her speak to that a little bit.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I just want to talk briefly about the need in the market for attainably, tolerably priced rental units and home values. And this is something that was talked about with both the Planning Commission and the Housing Commission. It's just this real need for, first of all, to have equitable access and to have diversity among lifestyle clusters so that we're addressing the needs of young professionals and singles of all ages that are also looking for housing. And so it's a different dynamic. There's different lifestyle clusters and lifestyle preferences. We can talk about seniors, we can talk about students, but often that conversation misses the other lifestyle clusters, the young professionals, singles of all ages that are also looking for housing choices. And half of the market potential is for, among rental units, is for units that would have rents of no more than $900 a month. So $900 today is actually pretty moderate. Today, the markets are, in East Lansing, it's $1,100, $1,200. And in a student market where the rents are per bed or per head, the rents are even higher. So there's we've had, again, many conversations with the city staff about how do we improve, and with the Housing Commission, how do we improve diversity in the community? How do we provide equitable access for different races and ethnicities and cultures and walks of life? And the way to do that is to provide more housing choices that are attainable and tolerably priced. I'm not even really using the word affordable housing. There's always a need. I can prove in any market that there's a need for affordable housing, but even to have prices that are tolerable or attainable. So I and kind of segue off of what our speaker earlier had mentioned was just kind of the need for attainable prices. And I just really believe that if your prices are attainable, that you're going to have more diversity and more equitable access. The way to achieve lower prices is to build smaller units, basically. I mean, that's the market today. Two ways. First of all, you right-size the units, make sure the units are not getting supersized, and then also making sure that attached units are allowed. And so, thinking about different formats, rather than building large houses, we're building attached townhouses. And instead of building supersized apartments, that we're maybe building smaller lofts and providing other choices, considering things like accessory dwellings. So really kind of challenging the notion that renters go into apartments and buyers buy big houses. Instead, it's really like, well, to get the prices down, we need to be providing lofts that are designed not for students, but designed for other lifestyle clusters. And there are ways to do that. I could talk for half an hour about design, but it's about building amenities and unit amenities and making sure that they're appealing to other lifestyle clusters and segments. So sorry to go long on that.
Commissioner Cahill?
Okay. I wanted to follow up on what Janelle said about universal design. In 2010, my husband and I, we moved to Avondale Square. And Avondale Square gets criticized a lot, but I think it accomplished a lot of the things that the city wanted, because we have people that are first-time home buyers in there, and some of them received assistance from the city or MSU, different things like that. We didn't, but we were lucky we didn't need it, so not that we're millionaires or anything. And then we also made sure that our house was first floor master bedroom, and our bathroom, everything's universal, except we don't have the bars. But you come in our garage, I call it the one bump, you just come over the door and you're in. And you can walk in from the front door if you want, but for when we moved there, our dogs were old. It helped them as well. And when we had guests come, it's been great. And so I'd like to see every house built that way. And then, okay, so we have a good mix of people there. And a lot of them have sold, even the ones where people moved in, it was their first home, they've sold them. So it's moving well. And then I want to say that I'm on the Capital Area Housing Partnership Board as well. And they build a ramp for every home. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. When I was growing up, my dad had a stroke when I was 13, and there were 10 kids. And we had to build a ramp after the fact. That was very hard. My dad directed us, but a ramp is essential. And then CAP also has $700 to $900 mortgage with down payment assistance. So I know there's representatives here to speak on that. And thank you.
Thanks. Well, there is a problem in East Lansing that we're not really addressing, and that is the impact of the demand for student rentals on the availability of attainable housing. We all know on these two commissions that students, there are a lot of students, not all students, but there are a lot of students who are willing to pay a very high price per month for rental housing. And that causes a challenge to interest any developer in developing lower cost housing that would be attainable for singles, young professionals, families, because if students are going to pay, as I think they do at the Landmark, $1,100 a month per head for their housing, how can we have interest developers in building housing that's going to generate much lower amount of income? Well, one of the things we tried, the city tried, was the 25% requirement. that new housing development in the downtown area needs to dedicate 25% of the units to owner-occupied, senior housing, or income-qualified housing. I don't know, maybe we haven't done an analysis about how successful that is and whether we think it's meeting its goals, but I'm sure that's underway. That's something that planning is looking at. But it still raises the problem that if attainable price-wise housing is built, students are going to want to live there. And they're going to be willing to pay more to live there, particularly if it's within easy commuting distance from the campus. And I think that's a big challenge that the city of East Lansing has in diversifying its housing. Certainly, almost everyone wants to diversify the housing. Almost everybody wants to have some young professionals come and possibly live downtown, but also live in the other neighborhoods. And we all want to have housing for seniors and families with children. But how do we do that when you have a whole big segment of housing demand that is willing and apparently able to pay prices that all those other groups can't afford to pay?
Yeah, so let me try to respond to that, and that's something we've talked about frequently as well. The interesting thing is that student enrollment isn't really going up a lot at the university. I mean, it's ticking up a little bit, and they've got plans to grow. You know, their plans say that they're going to grow to a point where they have more students than they've ever had in their past, but really only by a small margin. You know, so that if you look at the trend line on student enrollment, it kind of went up, and then it kind of took a tick down, and then it kind of recovered, and now we're at the point where, you know, it's just so slowly growing. And my sense is that the development of new student housing has really outpaced the rate of growth in student enrollment. I mean, all of the new student housing units, including in the city of Lansing and Meridian Township and the surrounding townships, it's kind of mind-boggling. So you start to wonder, where are all these students coming from? There's going to be a point where the number of choices in student housing is going to exceed the number of students. And I think we're getting close to that point if we're not already beyond that. So one thing I've even suggested is, don't sweat the student housing that's being developed in the other jurisdictions around you, you know, your shoulder neighborhood, your shoulder communities, to not sweat that too much, because that might actually provide kind of it might actually help loosen the market for you to open the door and provide more equitable access for other lifestyle clusters to come into East Lansing. So it's sort of like a release valve a little bit. So that's one approach, is to just kind of allow the market to kind of correct. Another approach is to actually, and Justin alluded to this, acquire land that the city can control. And when you own land, you can build a public-private partnership with developers that will work with you on the design in such a way that you can't ever really design a building and guarantee that it won't be filled by some students. But you can design it in such a way that it's less compelling for students and more compelling for other lifestyle clusters. So sometimes I work with developers, and for an example, they'll say, well, I really want to be a family-oriented community. I really want this to be a place for young families. Well, then build a top lot, build a playground, and put that front and center, and build that into the design. Or if you say, we want to build for students, well, then you build a shared office or a shared co-working space, and you put patio party play plazas up on the rooftop, and you do these sorts of things that students love. You know, there's no washer and dryer in the units, it's all communal washer and dryer. So these sorts of things, if you move away from some of those things and start providing amenities that students are not going to be as inclined to be willing to pay for, then you can also kind of shape the market that way. None of these things are going to be slam dunks. There's no magic box. There's no there's no perfect solution. I'm just trying to give you a few ideas. That's all.
Commissioner Cannon, did you have something?
Under what provision could we ask someone to design a pop-up community? Because we're in a crisis as far as housing, where you could either have rent or own, have daycare available immediately right in the neighborhood. And I'm thinking of designs where you could take like a classic housing lot, but put a creatively designed neighborhood on that particular lot. I mean, there's so many amazing designs going on right now. And I think if we would embrace those architects who are making a lot of livable space out of small areas and getting very creative about designing for the needs of families and singles and seniors, I don't think you'll have to worry about will people come. They'll be driving here in droves to get to these affordable housing units, and it'll increase the tax base for the city at the same time. And daycare, you need smaller dwelling units where the daycare is immediately accessible. So under what provision is that? Like a PUD? How do we get somebody to design something like that? Find a block, find a space, come up with a plan, and let's find a developer to draw it up.
That would be, thank you for that comment. That would be exactly what I was describing earlier with the PUD, is this entity, both the Planning Commission and the Housing Commission, if you look at areas that you would like to designate PUD or have that flexibility of design, and you can create that plan as this commission and adopt that as your approved PUD plan for that area, then the developers know coming out of the gate, this is what you expect for this space. And the only thing that's going to get approved in this space is something that is either in line with or similar to the approved PUD plan developed by this commission.
Other questions for our consultants? Mr. Sullivan? Thank you.
Thank you. So earlier, I think Commissioner Wagner, when he was talking about West Road, I think maybe he was inferring that some of us might prefer an IKEA or a Trader Joe's out there. But back to the 25% ordinance requirement. I know we had some discussions during Planning Commission meetings, Commissioner Boyle in particular, about potentially expanding that and making that a little bit more flexible. We had a situation with first floor apartments, perhaps making them wheelchair accessible and doing things like that. So that might be something else we could look at rather than shrinking that percentage down from 25%. Additionally, I guess just one of the things I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, so that we all agree that the price of rentals is high. Students are paying a lot. Some people think that perhaps there's too many of them. I just think that those things are perhaps mutually exclusive. Would not there being more supply reduce the rates that people are paying for those rentals and potentially free up housing and have a lot of other desired effects for the community, perhaps bringing people into our community from surrounding communities that we're essentially competing with financially. So I guess I just don't know how those things are all true at the same time. That would be a question.
So yes, just dynamics, the pushes and pulls of the marketplace. Absolutely, I see the correlations. I'm sorry, I absolutely see the correlations between those variables. And so I'm not quite sure I heard the question.
So how do we balance I don't think I need a mic, I'm all right. how do we balance the high price with potentially there being too much demand? How do those two things coexist at the same time? You know, when students have to essentially get their lease in October for the following school year, and we try to address that through an ordinance because there's apparently so much demand for this housing. How are we building too much housing if that's the case? And what can we do about it potentially? What other things can we really target to lower the price and also build more and open up other opportunities for other housing types that we're really trying to bring into the community?
Right, which is why I was kind of pointing to, so I think I understand what you're saying now, is that I've been saying, well, the pace of growth in student housing has been outstripping the growth in student enrollment. So wouldn't it have already settled itself out by now? Wouldn't the market have leveled off if that really were the case? We should already be leveling off. But we've talked about that as well. We kind of see this dynamic where it's kind of interesting, but there's a newness factor. You know, the hottest, all of a sudden we had all these brand new student lofts just popping up along Michigan Grand River Avenue corridor. And it's sort of like, I don't know if the students are like a school of fish. They all just seem to kind of migrate to the hottest, newest thing. And we haven't tried to, dissect the market to figure out, okay, did vacancy rates go up then among the older student apartments? Possibly. I didn't try to study it at that level of detail. But as I look at all that new student development, I would expect, my hypothesis is that first of all, I think it's already kind of settling down that the developers that we did talk to are already gun shy. They're already looking at that going, oh my gosh, collectively, we might have overdone this. And now what are we gonna do? You know, when we go into a pandemic and all of a sudden students are remote learning and the university starts shifting some of its policies, they're already realizing that they're pretty much where they should be, if not beyond. So now we have to, is the market going to settle? I mean, we have new dynamics going on now, the cost of labor, materials, and supply chain issues, and lack of enough developers, not enough developers willing to take the risk right now. Lots of things that are pushing these prices up. I would expect to see the market start to settle if we weren't in a pandemic. So I think right now it's just really tough to unravel those variables and isolate them and point and say, see, we overbuilt student housing and now the rents are coming down. But we're not seeing them come down because we're in a pandemic, which is creating a housing crisis. So very, very difficult to unravel the variables.
And I'm thinking, your point is well taken, Commissioner Sullivan. I seem to recall that, that the vote on that particular ordinance was split at council and ultimately it did prevail because the shoulder communities didn't join in. But my recollection was that the discussion was certainly from the property owners, the landlords, was that the housing study is coming, but that the presumption was that this overbuilding was going to relieve that potential pressure that Ms. Woods has talked about. That we've not seen it yet, but that I think the two members of council that ultimately voted against it, and certainly spoke against it, had to do with this sort of uncertainty that's, I can't think of the name of the properties on the former golf course. They've got a name now, University Edge or something like that. Yes. That when those come online soon, we might see that sort of, there you go. Apparently they're online already. So there's certainly enough construction going on in the area that it isn't quite done yet. But so I'm thinking that that's probably coming.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few things really quickly as well. One, Sharon said earlier that there's one really easy way to bring down the price, and that's through right-sizing the units, so having smaller units in general. There's another option there as well, density. The more density you get, the more economy of scale you have to spread the costs out across the number of units, and so you can get more attainable units. But I also would say and I don't know how this is going to play out yet. It is going into court. It's been filed. But follow Ann Arbor in this case. They passed their ordinance to hopefully relieve the demand around leasing and the pressure around leasing, changing it to landlords requiring that they have to re-sign within 70 days of executing that first lease, to now they can't pressure them or show the units until 150 days until the lease is done. That is going to go to court. It's been filed in federal court, and so the outcome of that will greatly provide some direction for what you may be able to do here, because if you can relieve that pressure valve from the landlord side, that's going to stop some of the demand to sign right away.
That was the point of that ordinance that we had. You're aware of that, so.
We'll see what the court does.
Sure. Commissioner Wolf?
Yeah, I just want to make an observation on the rental market. After having been here for decades, it appears to me the student rental market has changed in the last 5 years. Here we are, almost the end of September. If you look around town, drive around town, walk around town, you can find vacancies all over the place. There are apartments, there are houses that are looking for tenants right now. And normally, in my experience, by now, everything would be full. So I think we can see an indication that the market is pretty close to, if not oversaturated now.
Any other questions for the consultants? Mr. Rosen, Commissioner Rosen?
Just a couple of comments. And I think the idea of this planning exercise is admirable and very well deserved. And the discussion of a variety of different planning approaches is also very important. And I'm pleased to see the references to planned urban developments. I hadn't been really following these kinds of developments for a long time, but back in graduate school I actually took a couple of courses in this area. So it was nice to see that again. The question I have, though, is one of feasibility for all of this. There's a lot of details we're talking about, which are obviously very, very important, and I don't want to get into any of those. But underlying all of this is the notion that if I understood the study that was done to support this plan, if I understand that correctly, it makes an assumption that there is or will be a fairly robust growth in the city of East Lansing. And in addition, and maybe I'm interpreting this incorrectly, but in addition to that, part of the relevance of the research study that was done was to demonstrate how more population could be drawn to the city of East Lansing by capturing population that would otherwise go to surrounding communities perhaps, or even move here from elsewhere. The problem I'm having, and this may be a technical discussion to have offline, but I'm not quite sure I see where this growth is coming from. And in full disclosure, I was the chair of the Complete Count Committee for the 2020 census, and I've been involved in demographics most of my life. And a big problem with the city of East Lansing has been for quite a while that it hasn't been able to crack that 50,000 population threshold, which, as many of us know, but maybe the rest of you don't know, is critical because there are a variety of federal spending programs, maybe there's some state spending programs as well, that require cities of 50,000, or will allow cities of 50,000 or more to require more support. So that's very important. And I don't see where this growth is coming from. If all of the statistical information that's been collected is correct, all of the student growth in the university here has not materially contributed to the growth of the population of the city. I'm not sure that's correct, but that's what the data show. The other thing that related to that bothers me about this, and again, I'd like to get some clarification. How do you, what is the logic behind assessing or analyzing the need for housing by looking at the movement of population into the community, which occurs all the time, but excluding the movement of population out of the community, which also occurs at the same time. So I guess my basic comment and question, and I don't know if there's an answer for this at this time, is that have we used adequate, or are the data underlying this plan, are they adequate to what we're trying to do, and are they realistic for what we're trying to do? Because it seems to be promoting a greater amount of building than may be warranted at this time. So I'll just leave it at that.
So if you don't mind, can I go ahead and answer that? So I do want to clarify one thing. We don't have real aggressive numbers on the growth of the city of East Lansing. So I actually do have an exhibit in the report that shows how much we're forecasting the growth among both homeowners and renters. And really all I'm doing is a gentle trend line off of recent years. And it's kind of buried in the report. But I don't see, what I'm not doing is like ramping up the growth really aggressively. What I am doing though is looking for more diversification, because that is one of the things that the city asked for when we started the study. It wasn't so much like, let's keep the students the same and grow them, and let's keep all the other demographics the same, but grow them at the same rate. It was really a challenge of, if we keep the students the same, how do we achieve more diversification? So that's really where the growth comes in from, is to say, you know, how do we just diversify by having more young professionals, for example, or more singles of all ages, or more families. So really what I was focused on is trying to understand the market potential for those groups. You have another question about, absolutely, the study focuses on in-migration into the city. That's how we measure the market potential. So I really do focus on how many households are migrating into East Lansing and what are they looking for. If I took out migration, I might actually have a zero number to work with. So in some communities, like if I did the study for the city of Lansing, we might have, hey, there's 1,000 households moving into the city of Lansing every year. Maybe there's 2,000 that are leaving, and I would end up with a negative number, like a negative 1,000. And it's really hard for me to study that group. So that's why methodologically, just analytically, we try to just study who's migrating into the city. We don't worry quite so much about who's actually leaving. And we just want to understand how many by lifestyle cluster are coming into the city each year and what are they looking for. And I'm really not anticipating that we will build out to the full market potential every year. I'm just trying to show you what the absolute capacity is just based on in-migration alone. So it's kind of a methodological, it's a numbers exercise is what it really is. So I hope that helps a little bit. I may not be answering your question fully, but I
understand what you're saying, and I understand that your goal is diversification. I understand that completely. It's just, in my mind, the numbers don't add up somehow. And I don't mean to undermine you, because I think I'm fairly supportive of all of this, but you know, when I look at a chart, and I don't remember what page it was on, but it shows that that you envision, and let's take diversity out of the picture for the moment. Let's just break it into renter occupied and owner occupied housing, and you have a chart that shows 5 different ways of achieving 1,250 new single-family dwellings in the city of East Lansing over the next 5 years. I'm saying to myself, yeah, you could. That's reasonable if you ignore the fact that some of the people who might have bought those homes are leaving. If you're only dealing with immigrants, sure, it shows you what the potential is, but I'm sorry, but I'm a demographer, and it just doesn't add up to me. You know, I used to do the forecast for the state of Michigan, And if I had ignored the out migrants, and I was demographer during the early 1980s when this state was, the butt of jokes across the whole country because so many people were living. If I had done my forecasts for anything based solely upon in-migrants, and there were in-migrants, this is where people don't understand. You have a state that's losing population, or community that's losing population, doesn't mean the only movement is out. There are people moving in, and you're correct. I just don't see how you come to some of the quantitative forecasts by not taking into account the larger population dynamic. That's only my question, but I do agree with you. I understand what you're getting, what you're trying to get at, and I do think we ought to be doing some of that in order to encourage other people who might not consider moving here to move here. It would be a terrific thing for the city, especially if we can diversify.
Right.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your comments. I really do appreciate it. And this is not the first time I've heard those comments, by the way, or those questions. So I've heard them in other communities, and I appreciate your your astuteness in studying the data and really thinking through it cerebrally. So there are some communities where I do this study, and they say we have a no growth policy. We want to diversify, but we don't really want to grow. In which case I would absolutely say, well, here's how many people are moving in, but we're going to adjust for that out-migration and bring the number down and just focus on diversification and not focus on growth. Going into this study, you are correct that I made the assumption that the city of East Lansing wants to grow. So this model, these numbers, totally support that assumption. It basically says, if we know that households are going to migrate out, we know that new households will come in and fill those units, and we also are assuming that you also want to grow, and this is what you need to build in order to meet the wants and needs by tenure and by building format in order to enable yourself to grow, if indeed that's what you want to do. So if you adjust the numbers for out-migration, then you're back to a zero growth model, and we can absolutely do that. We just back out the out-migration and assume that you don't want to grow. So I hope that helps. So thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Jack Cahill.
Yes, we talk about various groups that we have housing for: the students over 55, single family, young family, urban professional. I wonder, from an economic impact point of view, how those rank. Which group has the most economic impact on our city? Not that that's the only consideration, but I'm curious how they would rank in terms of economic impact.
That's a good question. I would say, if I'm an employee, if I'm a worker and I'm contributing to the tax base because I'm contributing to a business that is generating revenue, then I think that's moves you up in the rank. But I'm not convinced that lower income is an economic disadvantage to higher income. And the reason is that they tend to occupy smaller units that again generate more density. And so I don't really see the economic strata by income. I see it more by whether you're actively involved in the workforce and in the labor force, and whether you're actively employed. So I see an advantage there.
I think we tend to forget that what attracts adults are amenities like good restaurants, good shopping, and you don't really have that in East Lansing. So what are your thoughts?
No, that's a great question. I'm kind of.
This is a housing study, remember? That's a fair question, but.
Yeah, the thing is that.
If anybody has a thought on it, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm struggling with it a little bit because I do see a lot of amenities here, and I see a lot of amenities in East Lansing, in the city of Lansing, the greater Lansing area. So I tend to not see jurisdictional boundaries that are so delineated. I see, I see the sports arenas and downtown Lansing and the state capitol and, all of the, the Hannah Community Center. I mean, I see amenities throughout the region, and those are collectively what make me love living in central Michigan. Now for the city of East Lansing, I also see just, again, the university. I know that there are, things like the lifestyle shopping center and the movie theaters, and some of those are in your shoulder communities or in the surrounding communities. But I think as consumers, maybe we don't draw those jurisdictional boundaries quite so clearly in the sand. So I see the rivers, I see the trails, I see the amenities at the university. I don't want you to sell yourself short, that's all. So sorry for stuttering.
Oh, no, you're fine. And I hear what you're saying. I'm from here, but I've lived in other big cities, and I love my car, so I don't mind driving to Eastwood. I know we have the Capitol. I know we have all these wonderful places that we can travel, but if we're talking walkability and people want to walk outside of their house or apartment and go to a nice restaurant or go to a good shopping place like we did have at one time in East Lansing called Jacobson's, and there were other retail stores. You don't really have that anymore, in downtown. So I'm not trying to take away from what we do have, because we do have a lot here. That's why I live here. But there are things that are missing, so.
Sure.
Any other questions? Anything else?
Right, I think what Jennifer's saying in a way, it's kind of hard to spend your money here if there's no places to attract you, in a way, right? But also, like, I like the idea of some new housing, because I think you always need to mix it up, all right? If you don't have new housing, just all ages at the same age, sort of like, I plant trees, all right? So if you plant, 100,000 trees, they're all the same age, and you don't plant another tree for 20 years, well, same kind of thing. So we do need to have some infill, stuff like that, gives options, because all those students that are going to the new apartments, they're going to want a new house. If that makes any sense there.
Thanks. Actually, if I could piggyback on that, one of the question that I've got for Mr. Sprague, only because I didn't understand what you were talking about when you said sort of your dream would be to spread the highest density across the entire city. And are you basically saying that it should be possible to build just a question, right? I just want clarification, a sort of a really dense, maybe mid-rise apartment building in any zone. Is that what you're getting at?
No, essentially what I was getting at is the way that we typically create zoning districts. It starts with a very low density, estate style, if you can imagine, 1 acre unit or 1 acre lot. We tend to put minimum footprint sizes, so a minimum footprint of 1,500 square foot to build a house there. And then we step down in density and we say, okay, the next lot has to be a half acre, and we do a minimum footprint of 1,000 square feet. But by the time you start to do that, if you're trying to achieve diversity of income types, you pretty much priced any of the low to moderate income families out, because right now to build a 1,500 square foot first floor plan, you're looking at $300,000. And so at that point, so to me, density is the answer to solving the segregatory nature of zoning. Granted, I know that's a utopian sort of ideological view of zoning, and it's not appropriate for every community. But zoning has been sort of the tool that we've been able to utilize sort of as our means of saying we believe that the people that have can live in this district, and we're going to price them out by the requirements, the land requirements that are put in place, versus what we put here. So that's really ultimately what I was getting to is to try to understand how zoning and those policies around zoning impact the diversification within the community.
And there's no denying that it certainly can be lead to great segregation. I was reading about sort of a, when you said they're sort of spreading around the entire city, I've been reading lately about how do you start to encourage that increase, and the way that this particular author had written was basically in every zone they're by right permitted to build what's permitted in the next zone now. So in R1 you could build R1, but you can also build R2. And then sort of I'm just make up zoning classifications, but R2 could build what's currently permitted in theirs and the next one up, right? So that there's that gradual adjustment as you sort of get further and further away, things get more and more dense because you're actually permitting this sort of overlapping zoning, basically.
Correct. And another thing, there are some case studies you can start to look at now. The city of Minneapolis has eradicated what they consider single-family zoning. So they're looking at ways to alternative zone. One of the things that Sharon always talks about is not zoned by whether it's a single family or a multifamily, but zoned by type and unit structure and the purpose of that. And so if you already have houses in neighborhoods that were potentially, a sort of a one-unit detached, traditional what we consider to be a single-family home that's been converted into 6 apartments, then what's the difference of a 6-plex next door if it's built right? So thinking about things a little differently and understanding how is it really the use that you're trying to prevent, or is it the form you're trying to prevent, and then how do you integrate that in? And when I say density, specifically speaking, right now I've worked with builders that said their sweet spot, if we want somebody to, if we want them to build a unit, a for purchase unit at a sales price of $200,000 to $220,000, they need to get 16 to 18 units per acre. But if our neighborhoods don't permit that, then how can we ever expect to get the housing prices that we need to be able to diversify the housing or the demographics of the community? So that's really kind of the stuff that I like to focus on when we speak to the strategic plan, is how specifically are our policies really supporting or increasing the goals and the desires of the community, or actually hindering them based on how those designs are set. And so that's why I continue to go back to the idea of the PUD and looking at those traditional or those alternative development tools within your zoning, because that's going to get you to lower costs and more diversity from a policy standpoint than anything else in my mind that you currently have in place.
Any other? Sorry, Commissioner Rosen.
Oh, no, just with regard to that. Does the city of East Lansing have adequate vacant land that would allow PUD or some other creative planning approach that would incorporate several of these ideas, other than maybe that northern tier, that part that's on the northeast, I guess? Do we have places? In other words, can we actually do this someplace?
So I think that's where we come to some of the recommendations that come through in terms of looking at large areas that do exist in the city, which are largely, if not entirely, in the northern tier. And most of those are zoned for or envisioned for zoning that doesn't allow housing. So that's where this question of, should we revisit the future land use map? Should we look at some of the areas that are currently envisioned for C2 or C3 commercial and see whether it makes sense to look at those again from a housing lens? I think other than that, you're looking at, redevelopment. And so another of the areas that we're recommending moving forward with is really looking, first probably at the area north of downtown, in what is envisioned in the future land use map, and looking at whether kind of a step down in density as you approach the neighborhoods to the north would make sense in that instance, and whether within that context you could add some flexibility for these other types of missing middle housing types.
can I add onto that? That I'm not quite so quick to walk away from the downtown area. In fact, I think that, say what you like about the new middle office, and so we've talked about that enough tonight about the percentage of rentals. I would say that think about what that particular piece of property was like 5 years ago, right? It was a surface parking lot in our DDA, so underused, right? And so take a look, to my way of thinking, any surface parking lot within the DDA should be fair game, absolutely. I mean, now that's one person's opinion, and it's, sort of moving it from its current use to a much more intense and, quite frankly, I think a better use is a different, different discussion perhaps, but I think there's potential. Any other questions? Commissioner Levine? Thanks.
I'm really loud. It's not a, I know that we're getting late, and it's not a question, you don't have to answer it. So it's really just a comment, I would say, that one of the things that I'm grappling with, having been born, raised, gotten 2 degrees, not working in this city, is I think that this strategic plan as it stands today is very much supportive of generating income for the city and a tax base, and might be relatively pleasing to developers that were spoken to for the development of this plan. But if I'm thinking of being like a true citizen living in the city of East Lansing, I'm not sure if I looked at this plan that I would feel that it would benefit our neighbors and community members in a significant way. Part of me feels like we need to see, to some extent, a little bit more of a focus on not bringing people in, but retaining folks, and redeveloping some of the areas that need to be redeveloped, and beautification and things like that. Which obviously, for a strategic plan, we need to be innovating and doing new things and bringing folks in. But I do wonder if there's a way that we could kind of integrate some of those other things that I hear neighbors talking about all the time, and wanting to see in our community. So really just a comment.
Thanks for that. On that note, any other remaining, we got one more step that we'd like to cover tonight, but any other, and so certainly don't want to stop conversation or questions, but are there any other remaining either comments or questions for the consultants? All right, then I'll back to Mr. Fehrenbach regarding the near-term action housing plan.
Great, so thank you, Chair. So on page 31 of the packet, we're getting to the last few pages. Staff has really taken the initiative to start the conversation here by distilling, many of the recommendations that are in the strategic plans into really just 7 here that are organized as the goal, and then some of the strategies and projects we would work on to address those goals, as well as just sort of who the responsible staff would be, and then ultimately a placeholder for some timelines. So this is really a fluid document. It's a draft. It's a starting place for your conversation. Obviously, there's limits in terms of the amount of resources we have on staff here. Pretty much looking at the team here. But these are things that we think are priorities based on what the experts are telling us, and priorities for the near term. It doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't work on some of the other items that are recommended in the larger plan, but these are really the near term goals. So I don't think I need to read them all to you, but I would love to hear your feedback in terms of whether we're on the right path here, whether there's something missing, whether there's something on here that maybe needs rethinking. And again, it's a fluid document and something that can certainly change over time. But ultimately, I think we'd like to take these goals to the City Council, make sure that they're aligned with the direction they want to go, and then obviously begin the work. A lot of this would come back to the Planning Commission and the Housing Commission and other commissions, and certainly there's quite a lot of room for public engagement around these issues as well.
I presume that each of you had the opportunity to review this, those 7 ideas, and of course, Some are more geared toward the planning commission and some are more toward the housing commission. Were there any specific thoughts or concerns or perhaps things you're not seeing that you'd like to see? And keep in mind, as Mr. Fehrenbach had said, this is what they're calling the near-term action plan, that ultimately they're, excuse me, that's going to be, there's going to be a much, I guess, more intense document that will come as, with regards to Ms. Hill's comments earlier, so there's no reason to hurry it, but here are a couple of quick thoughts about distillation of that, the strategic plan and things that might be put in place a little bit more quickly. Questions or comments for Mr. Fehrenbach or the rest of the staff? Commissioner Ferguson?
Does Michigan State, are you having any sort of conversation with the university on any of this?
So the question is, are we engaged with Michigan State University on any of this? Certainly, we meet regularly with Michigan State. We talk about a broad range of issues as it relates to housing, as it relates to many other things. Specifically, getting their feedback in these particular areas is not something we've specifically done, but it's certainly a good idea and something we can keep in mind as we move forward in this process. But they've definitely been very engaged overall in the housing study effort. I know that Sharon and Justin have had many conversations with them, and they remain our partner in this.
Was there something in particular you found troubling that might be missing? That...
No, I just hear that a lot, but is that really happening? But, you know, that's just a comment.
Other questions or concerns? Commissioner Wolf?
Apologies, all. I think these mics are all dying, so I will do my best to triage.
Yeah, can you explain item number 1 a little bit more? As I read it, it sounds as though we're fairly well along now on the Shaping the Avenue plan, but this sounds like it might be talking about a reduced version of that or something. Explain that item.
Yeah, hi, this is Peter. So, the idea here was to take on some of the momentum that's been in the Shaping the Avenue project. Obviously, I'm coming to this kind of midstream, but I did work on the Shaping the Avenue project in a neighboring community for a while. And you know, in lieu of maybe full adoption of the plan, which is a great endeavor, I think we can all agree to adopt the plan and incorporate it into our zoning districts, is to identify in a smaller geographic area and try to incorporate some of these elements into that. So really what the plan or the idea is now, and obviously this is subject to much more discussion beyond tonight at individual meetings, incorporate those elements into a smaller geographic area, possibly the area that Director Fehrenbach mentioned a second ago, the neighborhoods north of the downtown, some sort of step-down district. So some sort of mid-district between the the dense, taller downtown and the neighborhoods to the north. So the idea here is just to plug in what we can and where it's best applicable. So it's not throwing out the entire, it's not throwing out the Shaping the Avenue plan whatsoever. It's just trying to identify a new district where maybe we'd have some faster wins in lieu of adopting the entire plan wholesale.
Just a second. Was there anything else, Commissioner Wolf? No. Thank you. Commissioner Taylor.
One of the criticisms I have of University Edge product, I'll just speak loud. Okay, one of the criticisms I have of the University Edge project, okay, again, this is going to be like tree, landscape, canopy oriented, is when you push these projects really close to the street, you lose all the street trees. And all you get is little, you know, piddly little things, like pretend this is a tree versus the big tree with canopy. And everything with climate change, now it's very important to have shade trees. And you look at parking lots. The parking lots, I'd like to see that improved, and I'd like to talk to staff about that separately and more than once. is when a design is built for a parking lot, that there be adequate space for a tree, not like basically a grave site. Okay, because the trees can't survive in that, and the snow is pushed up on it. Just go to like Meyer parking lot and other places like that. The trees just never produce any real canopy. We don't get any shade. So that needs to be really a big part of it too. We just can't allow little tiny trees. And then also, a major wish of mine would be that if 10 trees are put into a development and 50 shrubs, in 5 years there's 10 trees and 50 shrubs, and 10 years and 10, 20, 30, 40 in perpetuity. That just because they die doesn't mean they don't get replaced. Thank you.
Okay. I don't really know where this fits in so much, but I think in my experience, I just feel like it needs to be noted here that one of the major issues I think about moving into downtown, whether we obtain housing for, sorry, it's just distracting, whether we obtain housing that is, hey Larry, sorry, it's just distracting, I'm sorry, I can't think. So even if we create housing where lower income families can come in, I think taxes in our city are extremely high. When I talk to people, that's a major impediment to actually moving in downtown. I live kind of on the outer skirts, which is actually in this interesting little area where it's actually Clinton County, but city of East Lansing, and our taxes are considerably lower, and I know a lot of people move out that way for those purposes too. Because I think that even if we have a house that's $150,000, your taxes are just so much more. And if you go to Okemos or DeWitt or any of the surrounding communities or Lansing, for example, yeah, it's a big difference between the additional, in addition to your mortgage, in addition to everything. And I think it has to be considered somewhere in here that even if we can create this price point downtown, we're still adding so much more to somebody's daily, and I think it continues to push people out.
Other questions or comments? I presume that. Oh, sorry. And we're gonna. The individual commissions will take these 7 points back to them for specific discussion amongst ourselves. But before we do that, any final comments about these 7 points of this near-term housing action plan? All right, thank you. Again, then going back to our agenda, that brings us to the end. I'll just one more opportunity. Anything for the good of the cause. I'm told to remind, presumably everybody here, that there are snacks to take away if you're so inclined. If not, a motion to adjourn would be in order. I will say there was a moved by Vice Chair Boyle and seconded by Commissioner Jackie Cahill. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. 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 And those opposed. Thank you. We're adjourned.